I am a Democrat and very much interested in seeing how this conversation might regard the question of independent politics and independent candidacies as they start to mushroom around the country. A lot of the indications are in key states throughout the United States that the fastest growing segment of voters are not registered Democrats or registered Republicans, but registered independents. So here to talk to us about that, we have a roster of folks from the organization. They're going to be talking about why they think SAM represents a next step forward in this regard. And we're going to kick it off by introducing the chairman of SAM, someone who is also a former congressman in my neck of the woods here in the state of Florida, and also a cable television commentator on MSNBC. Of course, former congressman and chairman of SAM, David Jolly. Good evening, Congressman Jolly.
Hey, good evening, Fernand, and thank you for doing this. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight to learn a little bit more about SAM, but also for this conversation about independent parties and independent candidates. I know we have people joining us who are participants in other minor parties, not SAM. We have some people who are independents, Republicans, Democrats. Thank you for being here tonight. And Fernand, congratulations on your new role as an NBC contributor. And thank you for joining us tonight as a moderator, though not a member of SAM. We appreciate you lending your talents tonight.
It's my pleasure. And Congressman, if you don't mind, I'd like to just dive right in because you actually are one of the figures that over the last 4 years, you gained a tremendous national profile. You, of course, famously were a Republican member of Congress. You were willing to challenge your party when in Congress. Then you left the party and you had every opportunity to either join the Democratic Party, go back and try and reform the Republican Party from within, but you decided to actually stake out this role as a political independent. Why did you take that path and why did you do it with SAM?
Yeah. No, I love that, Fernand. And I got to tell you, one of the reasons I'm an independent is because I love independent politics. I'd been a Republican since I registered to vote at 18. And I suppose in retrospect, I was never quite a good enough Republican, by the dogma of the GOP. And if I were to join the Democratic Party, I would just become a part of a party that I wasn't a good enough Democrat at that point. Look, I left the party over the direction it was currently going, and I knew I would feel the relief of separating myself from the Republican Party. What I didn't realize was the freedom I would feel of being completely untethered to a political party and being able to really exercise the independent thought I had tried to bring to one of the two major parties, to the Republican Party. I think a lot of voters, probably people on the call tonight, have had a similar experience where maybe you've signed up for one of the two major parties based on a conviction you share on issues of healthcare or taxes or reproductive rights, regulation, whatever it might be. But in today's parties, if you sign up for one issue, you kind of have to sign up for all of them. And that doesn't really work for a lot of voters. So look, for people who are ardent members of the Democratic or Republican Party because those parties reflect your values, God bless you. That's fantastic. But we know by the numbers, somewhere between 30 and 40% of Americans today reject the two major parties. They want the independent movement, the independent party, if you will. I found my home in SAM as a way to participate in independent politics.
Congressman, again, there is no questioning the numbers. As you alluded to, there is a massive movement towards independent registrations all throughout all 50 states. But for a lot of us that are in the art of political consulting and work in those campaigns, when we think of independent candidacies, we think of one word, and that's spoilers. Candidates that end up running great races and fielding good candidates, but really tip the balance of the electoral side to one party or another. How would you and how does SAM plan to address that concern about really spoiler candidacies?
Yeah, I love that question because first, let me tell you what's different and new about the Serve America movement, the SAM party, compared to other independent parties or other minor parties. And then let's deconstruct the spoiler argument. The SAM party is unlike any political organization I've ever been a part of or I've ever seen. We are familiar with minor parties, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and so forth. Those alternative parties are still rooted in ideology, in dogma. What SAM has built is a coalition of former and current Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We're all over the map, where ideology is not the defining factor in our association. In fact, I call ourselves the true big tent party, progressives, conservatives, and Democrats. And instead of operating on this left-right ideological spectrum that we've come to intuitively default our politics to, we shift to a totally different spectrum and say, look, why don't we come together as a coalition around the shared values and shared principles of problem solving, of accountability, of democracy protection through electoral reforms, opening up primaries, creating more competitive electoral platforms, reforming gerrymandering, providing transparency to campaign finance. But at the end of the day, what we're acknowledging is for the hardest issues we face today, healthcare, immigration, taxes, whatever they might be, sometimes the answer is on the left, sometimes on the right, sometimes in the middle. Why should we shut ourselves out to solutions based on this left-right spectrum? And I think too often people conflate these problem-solving initiatives with being moderate in ideology. We don't do that at SAM. We don't try to push everybody's ideology somewhere into the center. We say, bring your ideology and let's figure out how these competing and contrasting ideologies can solve the problems. Very quickly, to deconstruct the spoiler argument. You are right that we often see an independent sometimes take from one party or the other, but not be viable in a general election. We want to test the theory of the case. If you go back to the 92 presidential race, where the moment met an independent candidate by the name of Ross Perot, people often forget Ross Perot led the presidential race in the summer of 1992 with 37% of the vote to 24 for the incumbent George Bush and 24 for Bill Clinton. He led the race. Now, he was an imperfect candidate who dropped out, and by the time he got back in, he still finished at 19%. A fifth of the nation still voted for him. We see once in a generation these disruptive opportunities for independent politics. I believe, and the folks at SAM believe, that if we can recruit viable independent candidates that can be seen as choices in equity on the ballot with a Republican and a Democratic nominee, that we know the independent voters are out there. When people register to vote, you choose R, D, or I, right? And those are essentially choices in equity when you're registering to vote. It's a generic choice. You're checking a box on a piece of paper, R, D, or I, and we roughly self-sort a third, a third, a third. But on the first Tuesday in November, we perform 50-50. Why is that? We believe, and in large part because of hurdles put up by the two major parties, that it is so difficult for a viable independent candidate to reach that first Tuesday in November that there aren't choices in equity. And that's why we see the 50-50 voting breakdown in November. At SAM, we're determined both to build a coalition around these shared values, but to identify, recruit, and run viable independent candidates that can compete with the two major parties.
Thank you so much for that, Congressman Jolly. And on that note, let's actually talk to someone who's run as an independent candidate before, and how that experience is now impacting the role that they're doing with SAM. Of course, I'm talking about the chairman of SAM in Connecticut, Monty Frank. Monty, welcome aboard. And can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to run as an independent candidate in 2018 in the state of Connecticut, and how that led eventually to your involvement with SAM?
Happy to do that. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Congressman, for your leadership. It's an interesting story. I mean, lifelong Democrat. I got a call on the way to the office one morning in 2000 and early 2018. And the call was something like, Oz Griebel is going to run for governor. And the campaign wants to talk to you about being his running mate. And, my jaw dropped to the floor. I knew Oz by reputation as being an extremely important person in the state, ran for governor as a Republican in 2010, did well, lost in the primary, a man of incredible integrity, knowledge of the state, deep-rooted in policy. And I said, I'm a Democrat, right? And I believe in all these issues. And I went down the list of the red meat Democratic issues, and they're like, yeah, of course, we know all that stuff. That's why we want to talk to you. So I agreed to take the meeting. Oz and I had a long discussion, largely around policy. And we found that we had much more in common than you would expect from a lifelong Republican and a lifelong Democrat. We worked through all the issues. And then we started talking about principles of good governance, like governance. And this is how we would govern when we win. And what we found as we jumped into the campaign and actually were in Republican kitchens and Democratic kitchens is that people were more interested in fixing our broken state house and our broken democracy than there were in the actual ideological issues that the parties drive people towards to push them into corners to energize their bases. And so essentially, we were Sam before we knew about Sam, because we were having those discussions and having those meetings. And then we were thrilled that Sam endorsed us, and we started realizing that we weren't an island here in Connecticut, that there were people all over the country who shared our shared values around accountability and transparency and problem solving and electoral competition. And it was enlightening and liberating, as the congressman said. We did pretty well. We fought our way into all the debates. I think objectively, we won all the debates. We were endorsed by the Hartford Courant, which is the largest newspaper in the state. And then the parties really started to pay attention to us, started doing their negative ads, and our bottom dropped out. But we did well enough to have, if we had registered as a Sam party, emerge as a minor party. And we continue to work afterwards to make sure that what we started continues and that we could build a real coalition around good governance and change the face of the democratic process in Connecticut.
Monty, tell me briefly, before we move on, what would you say from your perspective are Sam's short-term major goals and long-term major goals?
Well, the short term, we are building towards becoming a minor party and building our base. And we're doing that through energizing and reigniting the people who are involved in our campaign throughout the state. We have formed a Sam caucus in the legislature, which is essentially the problem solvers caucus around good governing principles. Our endorsed candidates are part of that caucus. We've got the deputy minority leader in the Senate as part of that caucus, and they're shoulder tapping their colleagues to say, hey, we're tired of this intractability in our state house. We want to solve the problems for the people, and they're bringing people in. We have municipal CEOs, our mayors, and our first selectmen around the state meeting along SAM principles. And what is so exciting about the caucus and the municipal leaders is it's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's people interested in possibly as running as a SAM candidate in 2021, and we're encouraging that. We're looking towards the 2022 election cycle to run a statewide candidate with the real probability of emerging out of that as a minor party, and then we'll start building towards major party status in 2026. But we're going to be a player from here on out to promote these. Again, not the left-right ideological issues. It's not a debate over whose dogma is better than the other party's dogma, but about ideas of good governance and trying to reform our democracy.
Thank you so much, Monty. And let's go from your home state of Connecticut to your neighboring state, the Empire State of New York to the north. With us now is the former Democratic mayor of Syracuse, New York, and 2018 Sam candidate for governor of New York, Stephanie Miner. Stephanie, good evening. Thanks for being here. And I'd love if you could please talk a little bit to us about how you first got involved with Sam and what was the experience being like running as a statewide candidate under the Sam banner, Stephanie?
Well, I think, Fernand, I want to first thank you and David for giving me, and I see that my Lieutenant Governor, Michael Volpe's on as well, the opportunity to speak about this. It really emanated from the fact that we were two mayors. And as mayors, every day you wake up and try to solve people's problems. And what Michael and I talked about was that it had become this point in the state where optics trumped substance. And ideas no longer mattered. It was about whether you could spin something. And more running into people who just felt more and more disenfranchised by their government, felt like solutions weren't being offered, and that government was systematically adding obstacles to try to prevent having full discussion of ideas. And so the partisanship was really, if you are a one-party state, you end up denying people voices. And when you do that, you systematically end up denying ideas, and then you're not getting the best kind of solutions. And so New York is a very big state, and it was a great adventure because clearly the system did not want us to succeed in getting on the ballot. We were able to do that, and we got enough votes to establish ourselves, and then the system came back and said they didn't want to have that happen either. But the thing that was perhaps the most illuminating was everywhere we went and everyone we talked about a sense that our politics is broken, the civility is broken, and we want and desperately need to find a way to make ideas matter and to make civility matter and to focus on solving problems and how we can move forward together as a democracy, as opposed to how we can cut and slice everyone into separate corners.
Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. And of course, we know that based on what you all are trying to accomplish, from my understanding, it's not just a regional organization. You all have national aspirations. So when you think about states like New York and Connecticut and the overall SAM universe, I'd like to have the director of operations for the organization, Zach Colby, join us. And Zach, tell us a little bit about the history of SAM, and what would you say are the goals going forward as you begin to assert an identity for a lot of people that are just becoming familiar with it for the first time?
Yeah, SAM actually began in 2017 and was founded in the wake of the 2016 elections by basically a group of concerned citizens, Republicans, Democrats, and independents who are concerned about the direction of our country and concerned about the direction of our democracy. And obviously we've seen those fears play out in amazing and like unconscionable ways in the last 3 years that have made it now has never been a better time for SAM. And at the beginning, SAM, we didn't really know what we were going to be. And when we had this idea of a non-ideological new party, that was sort of the light bulb moment. And that was the moment where we've seen growth, and our trajectory has gone immediately upwards from there. So the goal moving forward is to become a major player and the new party in the United States. And we believe that the non-ideological approach that David mentioned earlier is the way to really do that. And David can add a little bit of color onto the non-ideological approach and why we think that that's a better approach than third parties or new parties have taken in the past.
Thanks for that, Zach. And let me go to Congressman Jolly on that. But first, think about it in these terms, Congressman Jolly. There were reports in the news today that there already is a faction of people that are registered as Republicans who are looking to form their own party in response to the Trumpist takeover of the old Republican Party. When you think about SAM, will it be almost, Congressman, like an amoeba that will absorb and try and absorb all of those other independent type mushroom groups out there? Or do you see the organization asserting itself as its own destination for independent candidate and politics?
Hey, David, you're muted.
I think the answer to the question depends on an individual's approach to politics. And obviously, I know a lot of the former never Trumpers, as they're often labeled, and they're looking to start an alternative conservative party. And God bless them for doing that. I don't think that's the answer. I think there is a conservative party destination. It's the Republican Party, whether you accept the other values they currently represent or not. What is not out there is a platform that brings together competing ideologies. That's where SAM is unlike anything. Look, so the Republicans are trying to build a big tent around the people within their party. Democrats are trying to do the same. You know, after the House losses on November 3rd, we saw the Democratic caucus meeting where the AOC caucus and Abigail Spanberger and moderates had this fight over why'd they lose seats. The issue is not their individual ideologies. AOC was elevated by a progressive constituency, Spanberger by a moderate constituency, Matt Gaetz by a conservative constituency. The issue is we don't have a party today that provides a platform that welcomes all of those ideologies and a mechanism to figure out the right answers. Look, on policies, the issues we face today can be solved. In the healthcare debate, the issue with healthcare reform was certain people needed greater access, others needed greater affordability, and certain people lost out in that policy, right? Their prices went up or their policies got changed. They lost their doctors. Democrats were rewarded for speaking only to the first two constituencies. That's where their platform was. Republicans would only speak to the third because that's the only place they found votes. Neither party would speak to all three. That's the shortcoming of our two major parties. And it's something Sam is trying to do by the way we're constructing this Big Tent.